In the 1970s, researchers began to study the effects of the Vietnam War on soldiers, recognizing they were experiencing long-term psychological distress. Post-traumatic stress disorder was formally recognized in 1980, and by the 1990s, new treatments like EMDR and other innovative therapies began to emerge. However, it wasn't until 2001 that researchers coined the term trauma-informed to refer to, quote, social, behavioral, and mental health services that account for the possibility that clients may have experienced some form of past trauma, unquote. Since then, research studies have outlined some of the core principles of a trauma-informed approach, such as transparency and trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment. Each person may require a tailor-made approach, and offering trauma-informed care is often not a linear process. So while this research has been bandying about and evolving for decades, it has only recently been adapted to educational spaces, and even more recently brought into the voice studio. Why is that? And how can trauma-informed practices benefit the work we do with singers, and even benefit us as teachers? Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my book of the same title, which will be released by Routledge Press this coming July 1st, in fact. Today, we are going to talk about trauma-informed care, and specifically trauma-informed care within the voice studio. Our special guest is Megan Durham, a voice teacher, a vocologist who, among her many gifts, collaborates with medical professionals to habilitate singers who have experienced vocal injury. More on her in just a moment. But first, let's define what trauma is and outline some of the core tenets of trauma-informed care. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, trauma is defined as, quote, an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's function and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being, unquote. In its 2023 article for the Journal of Singing, Durham notes that trauma is not the event itself. It is how our nervous system responds to the event and can result from any event that we perceive to be beyond our threshold for autonomous, embodied, and instinctive response. Trauma can impact cognitive, emotional, and physiological reactions. In his book, That Body Keeps the Score, noted trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk writes, if an organism is stuck in survival mode, its energies are focused on fighting off unseen enemies, which leaves no room for nurture, care, and love. For us humans, it means that as long as the mind is defending itself against invisible assaults, our closest bonds are threatened, along with our ability to imagine, plan, play, learn, and pay attention to other people's needs. Dr. L. Elizabeth Lincoln explains that trauma-informed care is defined as practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. SAMHSA outlines 4 key action items of a trauma-informed approach. First, realization. Develop a basic understanding of how trauma can impact individuals, families, groups, and communities. Second, recognize. Understand the signs of trauma, being cognizant of the fact that it may manifest in many ways depending on the individual's lived experience. Third, respond. Cultivate a growing list of trauma-sensitive tools that create a safe environment for the student. And finally, resist re-traumatization. Identify the student's triggers or stressors. So obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding trauma and implementing trauma-informed care. Let's consider how we can engage this knowledge in the voice studio with the help of my very special guest, Megan Durham. Megan, she, her, serves on the voice faculty at Bellarmine University and also at University of Louisville. A recognized vocologist with the Pan American Vocology Association, she also works as a singing voice specialist to habilitate injured singers. Megan is the education director for the Voice and Trauma Research and Connection Group and incorporates trauma-informed care into student-centered pedagogy. Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, David. It's just a joy to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation so much. And so I thought we would start, we love a good origin story on the podcast. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your background. I shared a little bit of your bio prior to this conversation, but talk a little bit about your background and how, and I guess maybe what things led you to investing in a trauma-informed approach.
Sure. Thank you so much for asking. It was like so many things in this conversation, very nonlinear. I was a plucky undergrad student. I had my BA in voice and I thought, I guess I'll go to grad school. And so I went to Westminster and while I was there, I just had a lot of difficulty. My voice had a lot of difficulty. I felt a lot of shame. And again, we're not blaming anything. It's just a lot of different factors at the time. And so vocally, I just felt less than. And that's really the most concise way to put it. And so, but I also was very fortunate to study with Marvin Kenzie, who really knit my soul back together most of the time. And that's when I sort of became introduced to working with folks who had voice injury. And at that time, I know right now, this is a topic that's a top of mind for a lot of people, but this was, early 2000s and sort of singing voice specialist and vocologist. And these were sort of not really terms that you heard as much as you're hearing now. And
Sure.
So I kind of went down that path to begin. And I was really lucky to study and work with Karen Wickland, who was based out of the Chicago area. And she unfortunately has since passed. But I learned so much information about how to interact with medical communities. Karen was really passionate about taking singing teachers and training them to work in habilitation. And so that was sort of one side of what was happening. But at the same time I was doing that, I, in my own just life journey, started practicing yoga. And there is so much, and anytime I sort of talk about this, I just will center, I'm a white het cis woman, and there's always a little bit of that sort of appropriation anytime we talk about these really wonderful modalities like yoga. And it taught me so much about who I was in my body. And there's always that sort of both and of how those things have been appropriated. But, so that inward journey was going on. And what I would start to see when I really started practicing as a singing voice specialist is we would have folks that would be, diagnosed with some sort of voice injury, or they would go to the doctor and the doctor would say, there's nothing wrong with you. And the person would say, well, but clearly I can't communicate in the way that feels most aligned with who I am. And so, or, we would get folks who come in, they have a diagnosis, but then they would start telling me stories about their lives. And at that time, I felt really ill-equipped to sit with the discomfort coming in my body. I didn't know how to hold a boundary with some of the things that were coming out. I didn't know how to work with sort of a lot of the emotional reactivity that was coming to the surface. And I thought, gosh, I feel like I need more tools. And it just so happened that I was in my own sort of yogic journey at the time. So I was made sort of a bridge between mindfulness and movement, and incorporating that into spaces. And that also, at the time I was working with Zabi Yamasaki, who has a wonderful program, Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Assault. And so that was really critical in my understanding of scaffolding trauma-informed care into voice spaces. And sort of here we are now. So it's been very windy, and I would say so much of it was kind of a combination of my personal work, sort of the confluence of my personal work with my professional, as so many of us come, to this.
Sure. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And you've just illustrated, you have kind of this wonderfully varied training from, being a voice teacher and a PAVA recognized vocologist, and also studied movement and for trauma, as well as various modalities of yoga and something called archetypal somatics, which I would love to find out more about.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how all of these things kind of fit together and offer maybe different insights on how trauma impacts the body and voice, and maybe could you give some examples of that?
Gosh,
I know that's right? It's a very big question. I apologize in advance.
It's how many coffees can we brew here?
Exactly.
Okay. When I think about early on, when I was again studying trauma-informed care specifically for yoga and for sort of bodies, something that became really that I got really curious around, and I write about this a fair bit, is what happens when we reframe what has historically been labeled a sort of vocal problem or like a fault, like something that is wrong in a body.
Yeah.
When we reorient that toward, that could be a survival strategy. That's a way that this body is continuing to show up. Now, what we're not saying is that a survival strategy is always a trauma response. And again, I think we have to be really clear that even though the statistics for trauma are very high, at the same time, we certainly aren't assuming that everyone coming in the door would necessarily identify with that. That's the highly personal rate. But I think if we think about trauma-informed care as like a universal precaution, where we are saying, we have a set of guidelines that can help inform us about how to be a more compassionate human, how to maybe show up in a space and first and foremost check our own bias. And so that for me, sort of the interconnectedness between how stress impacts bodies, that's such an important pillar, and also how oppression impacts bodies and certainly creates stress. And for me, there are so many great modalities out there. I mean, it's student-informed, student-centered pedagogy, sort of this beautiful work that you're putting together with Wholehearted, sort of pedagogy. I think for me in my journey, this connection not only between how we can create emergent learning, but also honor mental health. And that for me was sort of the things that I was knitting together. And I'm going to pause right there because there's a lot more I could say, but I just want to create some space if there's anything.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I always feel conscious about talking too much. I know this is a podcast, but
you cannot do that here. It's all good.
I know, it's weird.
No, that's thank you for sharing that. And I'm just wondering, because you have several different certifications in yoga, from what I recall, looking at your resume, and I'm always interested in how we as educators, and I think voice teachers are particularly good at doing this, synthesize information from lots of different places, right?
Yeah.
And see the connections from lots of different places. And that's what I'm hoping my book will do. But I'm wondering, for instance, from yoga, like what did you learn from yoga, particularly that gave you a different outlook on how trauma-informed care may be activated in the voice studio?
That's such a beautiful question. I don't know that I've ever really thought of it in this way, but I think the thing that immediately comes to mind when I think about my yoga journey, yoga taught me that I'm strong. Yoga taught me that my body is not something that needs to be changed. yoga taught me that my body in this, now wholeness is a word that does not resonate with everybody. And I want to be, I mean, that's the thing about language, right? Is that some words do not resonate. But for me,
Sure.
this idea that I don't have to find wholeness externally, that how my body is being is never wrong. When I started really feeling that in my body, I mean, it changed everything about my singing, because I thought all the years of shame about my high register, I'm a low mezzo, all the years of being told you're flat, all the years of being told, well, why can't you sustain this? You know, why aren't you doing blah, blah, blah? How do you square that when you're on the mat and you're feeling this sense of empowerment? And I think, the if I had to, again, really put a fine point on it, that we can't make assumptions about how the person in front of us is experiencing their voice. I do not care what we think we see. If we see a shaking jaw, if we see moving arms in a way that is like quote unquote non-normative, if we see shifting weight, if we see an expanding neck and strap muscles, I don't care what we think. We cannot assume how the person in front of us is experiencing sound in their body. And nothing has taught me more about that than working with individuals with PTSD, and particularly voice injury may be intertwined with that. There are so many ways that we might have to look, create our own evidence, right? I mean, there's, evidence-based science. These are great things. We are literally scientists in that studio, creating new pathways, new ways of inhabiting voice spaces, because for so many folks, what has traditionally been quote unquote evidence-based might not be working. And what do we do with that? What do we do when the straw phonation just is not the tool? What do we do when there is no tool? And we really have to sit in grief. How do we be with a voice that's dying? And maybe that's age, or maybe that's a voice that for whatever reason, there's not going to be reclamation, or there's a voice that has been written off as you're never going to get XYZ back. But we know through this sort of experimental model, through playfulness, through, creating new neural pathways, that there actually might be some strategy, right? So there's how, I think, gosh, I'm in a rabbit hole now, but I think yoga taught me that I am multiple, that I am vast, that I'm not a dual binary person. And one of the things that we know happens in chronic stress, and rightly so, even though it can be really debilitating, is, in the moment of, let's say, a life or death situation, or something that the body perceives as life and death, we have to make a safety call. Our body says this is safe or this is unsafe. And then very often, if we're not given agency or access to resource to really process that event, this idea of living life in a constant safe or unsafe binary can start to leak into other areas of our life. So things are either right or wrong, moral or immoral, pure, dirty, you name it, on pitch, off pitch. Now I get that could be for some concrete, but I don't actually view it as that anymore. So how do we help people that have lived their lives in a fortress of sort of competing duality to find a way maybe to soften, or at least at first to notice, or heck, maybe at first just to be in the grief of that all without changing a damn thing? Because we're so driven through urgency to make changes. But very often I have found that just sitting with someone and creating a space where their pain can be witnessed without the need to change is such a gift, even if ultimately we might move them forward in their goal. So gosh, so many things. But I think, this idea that my body is not wrong and that I am vast. I'm multiple things all at one time.
Obviously, there are different kinds of trauma, and different people react to trauma in different ways. As you said, some people may not even define something that they've had in the past as trauma, and some may. Can you talk a little bit about how do you assess whether or not a student you feel may have experienced trauma, and kind of help them come up with a game plan for how to succeed in the studio? And I want to acknowledge that that may not even be necessarily naming.
Yeah.
Right, naming for the students, certainly
Right.
what they're experiencing, but how do you start to make an assessment about, like, there's something that's going on here that's beyond maybe, like, this little thing will solve this, right? As we're saying, it's maybe a deeper seated issue. How do you assess those moments, and I guess stay curious with the student about how to start to get a sense of its scope? Does that make sense?
So it's funny because a lot of my my colleagues, if they're, maybe a NATS member, or maybe have seen a workshop, sort of, they know that, I'm really passionate about this trauma-informed work. It's interesting. My students in academia, I don't know that maybe if they hop on my website, but in other words, it's not necessarily something that I announce. Right now in my syllabus, we have the community agreements, and I think I mentioned somewhere in there, I lead from a student-centered trauma perspective. So, they might have an inkling there, but it's not like everybody that comes through the space, right, is necessarily coming with that knowledge. So that's the first thing. Having said that, my private work, there are many people that come, and they come maybe specifically for this kind of co-learning. I really do think that most of what I do is a co-learned event. And actually, I think that might be a good word to use in your question. I'm learning about them, they're learning about me. We're creating this sort of sense of mutual trust, and as if I'm sensing, to kind of go even a little bit on sort of the polyvagal, since you brought that up, this idea of safety comes up a lot. And like, I can never assume that my space is safe. Again, I'm a white cis woman. Like, there are many people for whom my presence just doesn't feel safe. And so safety is really only something we can create in relationship. If I am sensing that for whatever reason, and maybe it's that I am sort of getting transference in my body. My colleague Lisa Monti talks a lot about this, so it's really fascinating. Or if I'm presencing some sort of counter transference, maybe happening, and who knows, because so much of this is subconscious. That's when my spidey sense is always like a little peaked of like, ooh, I don't feel like we are having the same conversation. Now, certainly that doesn't mean trauma, right? Maybe, though, I'm starting to notice that if I use a word like breath, or if I use a word like, or even if I inquiry, like, tell me, what do you think of when you hear the word support? I love asking questions about if I have a new student and I know that they've gone through the voice journey, and I'm so curious what language resonates with them, right? So we might engage in a dialogue around language, and that might spark some really interesting threads around, I had this time where, that didn't really work for me, or, I sort of feel my body do this when ... And so we might get some surface level indications about how their nervous system responds in the space that way. And then I'm trying to think how I can be a little bit more specific without being too, I have absolutely had, and I wonder if you've experienced this, I'm sure listeners maybe have. I've had students that have had panic attacks, right, in the session. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean trauma, but it might mean, wow, this person needs some kind of support that maybe I can give, but maybe I can't give that. And I think, without giving too many specifics, just for privacy reasons, I think one of the things I always have in my back pocket is a statement like, I'm not sure that I can best support you in this moment. Is there a way we can work together to find a strategy for you so that you can feel supported? I think one of the worst things we can do if we're sensing something that might be going on with a student is, well, first is pry too much, right? With that. The second is say, well, you need a therapist. There is a lot of, I believe in therapy. That's great. And there are all kinds of forms of non-traditional therapy, and there are all kinds of ways in which people might not seek therapy, sort of in a traditional Western modality. Also, that's a huge assumption, right? And so even well-intentioned, I'm much more likely to say, is there a way that I can support you in a different way if I can't support you through voice? What are some strategies? So the student doesn't feel left alone and sort of cast out of the space. So I think the most practical tool is really knowing your boundary, what you offer and what you don't, and that what you don't offer is as sacred as what you do offer. And having like a script for that, because sometimes I can feel really activated in those moments of what do I do? So if I have a couple things I can latch onto in my brain that give me a cue, I find that helpful. I'm not sure that I've really answered your question.
No, I sent this huge blimp of a question over to you, and you actually have. I just want to pull out a couple things that you said. So what I'm receiving is that this idea that trauma informed care is first of all it's what's not prescriptive, we do it in advance.
Practiced. Maybe that's not the word you're looking for, but it's
I don't know. English language has left the brain. But it's something that we practice on a regular basis, right? That it's not something we engage when we think that something's going wrong.
Yes.
So that's the first thing that I'm taking away is that it is the word's going to come to me by the end of the podcast. But that that we're practicing this all the time. We're practicing co-regulation. We're practicing co-creating safe space, right? So when if those moments do come up, we have already a really good foundation on which we can start to ask questions that are not invasive, but that maybe start to get to a little bit closer to the point of what may be happening in that moment for the student. Does that make sense?
You have so beautifully mirrored back sort of a word salad that I threw out your direction, and you put a little dressing on it and sent it back to me on a beautiful plate. Yeah, and actually the thing that you're reminding me too is being trauma informed is really less about what I'm offering to someone else. And it's more about me being in my own body. It's checking my bias. It's being with my sense of no and my sense of yes and my sense of maybe. It's my own cues and knowing, ooh, that's no in my body. I'm getting activated. Because if I don't know how no feels in my body, and if I don't have a relationship with those cues, those physical somatic cues, how am I going to receive it from someone else? And I think so much of this is about sturdy leadership. I'm a parent of two small boys, and Dr. Becky, who's sort of in the parenting zeitgeist, always talks about being a sturdy leader. So, and for anybody listening that knows Dr. Becky, but I think it's so true that so much of this work, as you beautifully put together on a plate for me, served it up, is being practiced in my own responses toward reactivity. Do I have a plan when the shit hits the fan? Do I know, if I come in and I have a new student, and the new student is, let's just make up they are sort of name dropping, and they have sung Verdi and they're 18, all the things that we're taught from, a young age, we're sort of being activated by, and we're thinking, okay, how can I lead with curiosity in this rather than dismantling let me tell you how it is, right? Because it's so easy. It's so easy to lead with that sort of power over, right? Very hard to, unpracticed, lead with power with, or power among. And so I think that is so much of this work, really. Again, even though we are talking about mental health and we're talking about trauma, I don't want to put a percent on it, but an overwhelming amount of this work is being with your own shit and noticing, how am I projecting in this space? And even if I'm not able to be consciously aware of that in the moment, can I self-reflect? Do I have trusted colleagues that are not on a social media platform comment thread that I trust to give me honest feedback that can help me unlearn, my own ways of being in the world that may not be serving me or the folks I'm with? Accountability. Accountability is huge, I think, in this work.
I've been really interested in the fact that, studies of vicarious trauma and compassion burnout, all of that is finally, I think, making its way into education. Yeah. And I'm really fascinated by the fact that that's been so slow, because I think we all feel the weight of it,
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. Slowness, right? The word you just said, slowness is, it's a privilege. And there's a great resource. We're going to take a bit of a, if that's okay. There's a great resource. It's White Supremacy Culture put together by Tima Okun and, oh goodness, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on the other author. I'll think about it and we can put it in the show notes. But if you go to I believe it's White Supremacy, Kenneth Jones, whitesupremacyculture.com, it has these really sort of hallmark characteristics of how this form of suppression impacts all of us. I'll also, if folks are familiar with Resmaa Medikim's work in racial justice work around somatics, his really beautiful text, My Grandmother's Hands, is really deep dive into how trauma impacts all bodies, but particularly sort of the trauma of white supremacy culture and how that also impacts all bodies, including those of us that then inhabit a white body. But one of the hallmarks of this kind of oppressive culture is urgency. And others include worship of the written word, paternalism. You go down the list and you're like, yep, music school. Oh, yep, that's it. Got it. Yeah. And perfectionism, certainly one in there, toxic perfectionism. And I think about urgency a lot, particularly in academia, because one of the things that I find a little tricky is, I have a private studio in which we're doing a very particular kind of work together. And then in the academic arena, we have deadlines, we have juries, we have all of these benchmarks, which again aren't inherently bad, but the way that the pressure builds up and the way that we feel like a body has to get from A to F in 4 years, is in so many ways like unsustainable. And so I'm really curious about what does that look like? How do we change policy in music institutions to be more in alignment with the values that I know you and I are so passionate about? And that's hard. Because it's slow. The process is slow, but the way that the work often needs to happen is nonlinear. It's not like you're gonna, check all the boxes in a row.
Exactly. You don't flip a switch and say, "Great, we're trauma informed."
Right.
It's
yeah.
like,
exactly.
It's like 90 things have to happen at once.
Yeah.
And so it is difficult, but it's also like, but I think we've all experienced when a student feels safe.
Yeah.
Right. And starts to really open up, and you finally like actually see their essence. Like it's like, well, then that's why we're doing that's why we're doing this, right? It's not a kumbaya around a fireplace. It's that it's, I mean, look, I love that too, but it's not about that. It's actually, this is an evidence-based approach to helping students move further on their vocal journey.
Absolutely. And to your point, your wonderful point here, I think some of the pushback that perhaps in these types of modalities that you and I really appreciate is, well, it's too soft, or it's like you're bubble wrapping everybody, or like you're making, like everybody's got a quote unquote issue or whatever that is. And I mean, the reality is bodies that have been through the horrific levels of neglect, abuse, violence, oppression, these are fortresses. These are people that are not fragile. And it's so easy to see someone in a moment of reactivity and think, oh, well, they're, emotionally immature. Or again, cue any assumption that we have about how bodies are being in sort of public spaces. And so that's one thing. But the other thing that I think about is, I'll preface this by saying we can't be reduced to models of behavior. Like voices can't be, people can't be. And models of behavior can be really helpful when we're talking about highly complex things like states of being, right? And so that both and, I try to live in that both and. One of the things that I find really fascinating is sort of this idea of the window of capacity, or sometimes models call it window of tolerance. And, it's this idea that when I'm in this window, I might be really activated, but I've got a resource. I've got access or privilege to a resource that helps me to, recalibrate. Or I might actually be out of that window. Look, again, I probably said this a million times. I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old boy. I am outside my window of capacity at least 17,000 times a day. But I still have access. I have privilege to access to resources that bring me back into that window. When we experience things like chronic stress or trauma, it's not getting pulled out of the window that's a problem. It's chronically being stuck outside when we do not have privilege to access to be able to come back in. So in essence, our work as voice professionals is not to make sure everything is safe. In fact, that is not possible because we don't live in a safe world. What we're trying to do, maybe one of the things is actually increase through co-learning, through co-regulation, increase our capacity to be in discomfort, to know and to honor that this is a body that is a fortress. Are there ways that we can also notice how it is a sanctuary and sing from both places, because this is a body that knows how to do hard things? How can I support them in that? So again, not about safety. Safety is great. That's ideal. And that's the beginning of the work for me. It isn't bubble wrap. It's actually, how can we do really, really challenging things and skill build in that process?
Is there something that comes to mind for you when we talk about trauma-informed care, where you can offer trauma-informed care while staying within your boundary as a teacher? Can you give an example of that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a great two quick resources. The first, in the Nats Journal a couple of years ago now, I co-authored an article with Elisa Monti and Allison Reynolds on sort of this topic on sort of scope of practice. So if anybody's really interested in that, there's also a great article by authors. Let me get this. I think it's called Trauma Informed Care for All by Perky, Patel, and Phillips. And they have this great quote that says, trauma-informed care is not trauma-specific care. Now, I think that's such a lovely principle because, again, I think about this work, as you said, it's something I lead with it in every aspect. Well, I try, and sometimes I fail miserably. To be really clear, this is like not something that I talk about this a lot, but I'm also such a student, you know?
Oh, we're all
we're just
practicing.
all like trying, yeah.
Yeah, we're all practicing. All good here.
So, but because it's something that I'm constantly kind of presencing, I think that you sort of, it gets a little bit easier, I think, as time goes on to sort of innately cue into the internal boundary of like, ooh, that's a spidey sense that I'm getting. Ooh, that's a little bit of a red flag. So that's one cue that I might use is just the somatic cues of attunement. But another thing I think a lot about is being in the practice of sharing practices rather than swapping stories. And so someone might tell me something. I mean, I don't ask to hear people's stories, right? Certainly, though we are in this unique position as voice educators where, you know, people, there's the trope, you know, the voice teacher, you know, you're my therapist. And we can sort of chuckle at that. And I do think that we have to really be aware if a couple things maybe, is my rescuer persona being activated? Like, do I want to go in there and save the singing voices, right? That's interesting. And that might be a boundary we need to kind of confront there. Singing is innately healing. I mean, we can't get around that. We know this through evidence, right? But I am not the conduit of the healing. Like it's the voice, it's the music, it's the artistic space, maybe the co-regulation, right? But me personally, I am not a healer. That's going on for the person in front of me. If someone shares something really sacred with me or something really intense with me, the first thing is you need to be resourced. So if you do anticipate, and certainly we can't always anticipate this, but if you are somebody who is really interested in this work and wants to learn more and maybe do more sort of study in this work, I really recommend whatever accountability and therapy looks like for you, right? That might be traditional, that might be not traditional, but really having an accountability network so that you are well resourced for whatever someone might tell you. So that's important. But also, like, I'm not gonna share my story, right? And I'm certainly not gonna share advice about what they might do. That's a line for me. Having said that, sometimes that can get murky if we are there as teachers, and sometimes the trauma has happened in an artistic space, and we might need to share some advice around something professional. And I think that's a gray area. I think so much of this work is a gray area, but I think if we're resourced in our own accountability networks, things like that I think do get easier if we can cue into our body's own sense of boundary. And again, I just kind of like that little idea of sharing through practice. Is there a movement we might do together? Is there a breath we might do? Is there a song that might feel really right to express this rather than swapping story about it too much? Is that helpful?
It's very helpful. Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, I think part of the challenge is wanting to, in an effort to make the student feel safe, I think it's easy to think that sharing is a good idea.
Yeah.
And I had this great conversation actually with Harriet L. Schwartz a couple episodes ago, about this very thing, about boundaries, and she was like, what I've learned to do is pause and say, is this in service of the student? Is sharing this information in service of the student? And if it's not, then I won't, right? Which I'm like, is such a great thing to remember, especially around these things, because, we have all had students share things that have happened in our programs and really sense that they are looking to us for some sort of actionable, support. And so, engaging around those moments, I think, and saying, okay, what is for me and what is for them?
Yes.
Right. I think it's really, it makes it's very hard, but that, again, that boundary is one that, if we can really honor it, it's another thing that comes to me with Harriet's work is she's like, boundaries are porous.
Yes.
That they, things, it's not just this is a yes and this is a no, right? There has to be a sense of flexibility in it. So knowing where that place is, and knowing when and if to share, right? Yeah. I think there's just so much here. I find it really overwhelming and wonderful, because I think it's so at the heart of what naturally, as you said, comes up when people start to sing, right? Yeah. They're just expressing their vulnerability in a way, and so things are going to necessarily come out, right? And it's a question of, can we be? I love this the way that you're saying this, and I want to just mirror it back. Can we be resourced in dealing in those moments, knowing that we have, we are grounded in our own person, that we are operating from a place of presence, that we are operating from a place of regulation, and that when our spidey senses do go up, we can note it, and we can stay present, but also kind of be mindful of how to be in relationship.
Yeah.
In those moments. Does that make sense?
It makes it. Yeah. I think you're so gifted at so many things, but the way that you sort of encapsulate, it's like you should do a podcast or something. It's like, yeah. And the other thing, I know we're probably almost at time, but the other thing that kind of comes to mind is sort of the aspect of repair in all of this, because I am a people pleaser through and through. I have really, yeah. And in all of the wonderful things we've talked about, I want to say that I get this, I don't want to say the right or wrong binary, but man, I make mistakes. And sometimes real big ones, often. And what I really had to get in a more, I had to really do a lot of my own work around perfectionism and the shame spiral when I would say the wrong thing or have a rupture in attunement in a relationship, and then feel this huge weight of nausea and this feeling of, oh my gosh. And the big thing that I had to tease out was the difference between I make mistakes and I am a mistake. And really being able to separate those two things has been, I would say, really profound in my ability to handle no in my own body, that someone can tell me no and I am not a mistake in my core. I can take that feedback, even if it's something that I do feel a little shameful about in that moment, and I can metabolize that. I can go to someone to give me feedback. I can learn from that in a way that feels generative to something new.
Yeah. And gosh, it feels like actually a really great place to wrap up, because isn't that what we're trying to teach our students too?
Yeah.
We're just, I love, Kari Reagan in her book, talks about, we are advanced learners. We're still learning, we're still trying to figure out, and we are going to make mistakes. And so, like, how are we modeling those ways that we acknowledge our mistakes and yet don't become them, don't, and allow ourselves grace, and be boundaried but vulnerable enough to share those moments when appropriate. That part of the way that we get to be with students is that we get to share our own journeys where it's appropriate, and let them know that we are all working to build our own resilience and expand our own islands of knowledge and expand our own windows of tolerance. So when we do become triggered, we can come back to those moments, those touchstones, that we can, it's not a place that we stay, it's a place that we visit and can come back to.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. This is, I have to have you back, because we got through 2.5 questions, and it was exactly as it should be. I'm so pleased and so grateful for your time and your great insights, Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, David. You're an incredible human, and I can't wait for your book to come out.
Thank you so much. Given the diversity of our studios, it is inevitable that we will come across a student who experienced trauma. A 2019 report noted that 61% of adults experienced one or more types of adverse childhood experiences, and that at least 5 out of 10 deaths in the US are related in some way to trauma. Research highlighting trauma experienced during the pandemic is similarly dire. In equity-centered, trauma-informed education, Alex Chevron-Vinay writes, "The truth is that trauma is part of the human experience. So everyone in the school community may need a trauma-informed environment. Everyone benefits from the universal application of trauma-informed practices. And the more that we invest in these practices, the better we can care not only for our students, but ourselves." So, how are you engaging trauma-informed care in your voice studio? How has it benefited your students' growth? How are you balancing your own self-care in the midst of this challenging work? Sound off. Please feel free to email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com, or as always, you can find me on the socials. My handle on most platforms is @Sisco Songs and @wholeheartedvoicepedagogy. And as always, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. My next episode is something kind of special, and I do not want you to miss it. More soon. Take care of you.